Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heads Up, the weekly video podcast of the National Headache Foundation. I'm Dr. Lindsay Weitzel, migraine strategist, founder of the Facebook group Migraine Nation, and chronic daily migraine survivor. I am here with Dr. Vincent Martin. He is the president of the National Headache Foundation and the director of the Headache and Facial Pain Center at the University of Cincinnati. Hi, Dr. Martin. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Great. So we have an awesome topic today that everyone can relate to. We are going to be talking about triggers and migraine and separating fact versus fiction. So Dr. Martin and I recently returned from the 61st annual American Headache Society meeting in Philadelphia. And there, all the latest and greatest information in headache and migraine research was presented. And we will be bringing you this information in summary and different podcasts over the next many weeks. And we also will be bringing on podcast guests who were the scientists, pain psychologists, and physicians that presented information at this meeting. So stay tuned for that. That is going to be awesome. And we're going to be starting today with Dr. Martin because he won the John R. Graham Award at the American Headache Society meeting for his contribution and research in the field of migraine. And the talk he gave when he received that award was on triggers and on separating the facts versus the fiction. Now, we all have migraine triggers, and so we can all relate to this. So let's start by talking to Dr. Martin, and let's first ask, what is the official definition of a migraine trigger?
Well, migraine trigger is any factor upon exposure or withdrawal that precipitates a migraine attack, an acute migraine attack.
Right.
And we actually crafted that definition back in 2001 in a paper we wrote on migraine trigger factors for the clinics of North America.
Okay. All right. So it is my understanding that there's about 5 different types of migraine triggers that we classify these triggers into. There is behavioral triggers, there's environmental triggers, there's hormonal triggers, dietary and chemical triggers. Can you start by telling us what are some behavioral triggers?
Well, behavioral triggers could be things like stress, emotions. So you might get really upset, it triggers a headache. It could be other behavioral things like exercise. Exercise is a common trigger as well. Could be your dietary habits, like how you eat. So it's basically certain behaviors that in certain instances may trigger a headache.
Okay, and then environmental triggers. Can you give us just some common examples of those?
Well, the most common environmental trigger is going to be weather, but other environmental things could be air pollutants, such as ozone and nitrogen dioxide, and other things like mold counts. So things in the air that you breathe as well.
And hormonal, obviously menstrual periods, menopause, anything else to say on the hormonal triggers that are common?
Certain medications like oral contraceptives when used in certain ways can trigger headaches. Some hormone replacement therapy, which is a hormonal therapy, can trigger headache as well in susceptible patients.
And any specific dietary ones you want to mention?
There are a number of different potential dietary triggers. I think the fear is that if you start trying to avoid everything that's ever been shown to be a dietary trigger, it can sometimes be rather unhealthy. But the common ones are things like caffeine, particularly when you drink too much or too little, or you abstain from caffeine and actually you avoid it for a long period of time. You can have caffeine withdrawal headaches. Another one would be artificial sweeteners. Things like aspartame and sucralose that are added to various beverages. Other things would be monosodium glutamate, which is a flavor enhancer found in a lot of processed foods. So if the food doesn't taste particularly good, then it's very possible that MSG was added to make it taste better. Nitrites, which are preservatives found in lunch meats, bacon, and sausage, and a lot of processed meats. Those are probably the most common, but there are other ones too, like citrus fruits can sometimes trigger headaches, particularly if you consume it on an empty stomach.
Mm-hmm. And the last group was chemical. Can you give us an example or two of that?
Chemicals would include like a lot of household cleaners like ammonia, or even paint fumes or other solvents. Like if you work in a chemical factory or something, there can be sometimes you're exposed to various chemicals in the environment that can trigger headaches.
Okay. So what is the average length of time? I think that people would find this interesting because it's actually not the same for every trigger. But what's the average length of time that you think it usually takes from when you're exposed to a trigger to when it might lead to a migraine?
Depends on the trigger. Like studies would suggest factors like light and odors can trigger headache pretty quickly, usually within about an hour and a half. And light has even been shown to trigger it within a few minutes, to up to maybe 15 minutes. So those are real quick triggers. Some of the triggers that were a little bit longer to evolve into a headache were things like chocolate was like 22 hours. But there could be instances where it doesn't even trigger the same day. Like,
Right.
for example, with stress, they found that stress the day before could trigger headaches the following day. So in some instances, that may be over a 24-hour lag to generate a headache. And those are called letdown headaches, where stress triggers a headache.
Right. So can you tell us what a migraine prodrome is and how that relates to triggers and migraine?
Prodrome is where patients develop symptoms prior to the aura part of the migraine and or prior to the headache phase of migraine. And these symptoms can include things like intense fatigue, or it can include irritability or sensitivity to light or noise, or in some cases it could represent neck pain as well. And the confusion with prodrome is that some of these symptoms might potentially be attributed or falsely attributed as trigger factors, because these are parts just of a migraine attack itself, and some of them, have the same factors that we look at as triggers, like stress could be irritability, and sensitivity to light could be mistaken as a light trigger, or sensitivity to noise could be mistaken as a noise trigger. But one of the big myths is that there's some headache doctors that believe that all um, uh, purported triggers are simply prodromal symptoms, but there's certain types of triggers that would not be part of the prodrome. Like, you can't explain weather that way, you can't explain hormonal triggers that way, and even with some of the other triggers like light and noise, they've been clearly shown in experimental studies to trigger an attack
Mm-hmm.
within a short period of time. So the odds that those are completely caused by the prodrome, I think, are rather small. I can't rule out the possibility that maybe a little bit of light sensitivity couldn't account for some light triggers, but it's certainly not the whole tamale.
Do all people with migraine respond in the same way to all triggers?
Well, the triggers are very individualistic. So it's dangerous if you take the stance that you're going to avoid every known migraine trigger, because I don't know how you could even live life. I mean, you couldn't go outside, you couldn't be exposed to noise. Stress would bother you. I mean, there's just no way. And there's also hundreds of dietary triggers. So there's no way that you could possibly avoid all the triggers. And there actually was a nice study that was done by this company called Curator, where they have basically an app where they can try to statistically prove whether a trigger is truly associated with a headache or migraine. And a lot of the more common triggers, like chocolate, occurred in less than 5% of people could it be actually proven that they actually had chocolate as a trigger. And that was true for a lot of the dietary triggers.
What are some of the common myths regarding triggers?
Well, one myth is all trigger factors are created the same. So not only do individuals have different triggers, but the strength of each trigger differs. Like, for example, menstrual periods are a common trigger for many women, and probably about 2/3 of all women think that their headaches worsen around the menstrual periods. And those that they do have and around the menstrual period tend to be more severe and disabling than other times. That is a very potent trigger.
Mm-hmm.
The other trigger probably varies, that's very potent, varies by region of the country. There are some places where weather is an extremely potent trigger. And I can tell you in Cincinnati, Ohio, or St. Louis, or in the Midwest, and probably on the East Coast as well, that many times weather can be a huge trigger. What we found is that both low and falling barometric pressure, and the opposite of that, which is high and rising, can trigger headaches as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one that's really potent is stress.
Right.
There are studies that have looked at stress the day before and its ability to predict stress the next day. And it's fairly correlated that you can actually predict next day's headache by how much stress you had the day before to a certain degree. I mean, there's nothing that's perfect. But I think those are the big three, both stress, hormones, and weather.
Okay. Are there any, can you think of any triggers that people think are a really strong trigger that it really hasn't been proven? I guess there's chocolate. You already mentioned that. So maybe
Chocolate is probably one that people falsely attribute to causing headaches. I think some of the ingredients in foods can become issues because you can't really tell whether a given food has an ingredient. You just kind of make an assumption. Like take MSG, for example. When you look at all the studies of MSG, that MSG likely triggers headaches when it's in a liquid form. So if you were to have MSG that was added to, say, wonton soup or something, that'd be more likely to trigger a headache than MSG in food, because the food changes the absorption of MSG into your bloodstream. The other thing that's important too is the quantity of the trigger. So you can't just assume that just any exposure is going to produce a headache. So there could be times where the exposure to the trigger is quite great, and that may be more likely to produce a headache than at another time. And there was this other concept that there was an article that just published about a year ago. There's a concept called surprisal, and that's basically where it's not so much the change from the prior day that triggers the headache, but it's the change from whatever your average consumption is. So to give you an example, it'd be like if you're used to on a daily basis drinking 2 cups of coffee, and today you drink 4 or 5, then that's a change from whatever your norm is. That's more likely to trigger a headache. But the opposite may be true as well. If you don't drink any coffee that next day, then you're probably also more likely to have a headache. So this new thought that it's not so much the change from the day before, but the change from the norm. And what that means is your body kind of probably becomes acclimated to a certain trigger or exposure to a trigger. And then if you deviate from the norm of that, it might generate a headache.
I think that's a very important point. Not just surprisal in itself, which is a slightly more complicated point than the one I'm about to make, but some of these triggers, it's not the trigger alone, but it is the change from baseline. It's if you're eating more of it or less of it than usual, the body sort of likes the homeostasis, and it's the change that it doesn't like. It's just like the weather. It's not so much the storm, it's the change in the barometric pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So my next question is, when you meet a patient, do you utilize triggers as part of your therapy or as part of your evaluation of the patient?
Well, I'm a general internist, and I'm also board certified in headaches. So I kind of take a little bit of a different approach. My approach is to try to figure out what might be triggering the person's headaches. Do they have a neck injury, and that's triggering headaches that kind of go to the back of the head? Do they have something called TMJ, which is where this TMJ joint here, you might get arthritis, and that might trigger headaches, usually in the temple. Do they have problems with their sinuses or allergies that could trigger headache in kind of a mask-like distribution of the face? Is there some stress in their life? Maybe they've got some death in the family or some traumatic life event. Could that be triggering headache in them? We might need to manage that. So, could there be a hormonal trigger if it's a female patient? So each one of these, I'm going to try to pick off and address and treat in different ways.
What do you think is the best way to manage our triggers?
It depends on the trigger. Like if it's a hormonal trigger, you're going to want to stop falls in a hormone called estrogen. And there are different ways you can do that. Like with birth control pills, for example, sometimes women will have a week of placebo. During that week of placebo, the estrogen levels just plummet. So you might want to avoid the placebo week in that situation. For stress, you might want to try to manage the trigger. So you might learn relaxation techniques. You might do something called biofeedback, which is where you can kind of even like change the temperature of your finger if it's thermal biofeedback. And exercise can be very, very potent in relieving stress as well. If it's dietary and if it's something you can avoid, like let's say that a certain type of beer tends to trigger your headaches, 80% of the time, then that may be a trigger. The other important concept is that a trigger is not always a trigger. What that means is that it's not going to always trigger a headache 100% of the time. In fact, if a trigger is associated with a headache about half the time, then it probably represents a trigger, depending on what your baseline frequency is. I mean, if your frequency was 50% of the days, then a 50% rate of exposure causing headache wouldn't really prove it. But if it's occurring significantly higher than whatever your baseline is, then it probably is a trigger factor.
Is there a point where avoidance of your triggers can become a problem? Sort of focusing on that avoiding of triggers.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think there are two different ways to manage triggers. One is through avoidance, which means that you identify a trigger and then you try to avoid it. But there's another theory that was advanced by Dr. Paul Martin, who is not related to me, who believes that maybe avoidance is a poor strategy and that it creates a lot of anxiety and so forth over the trigger factor, and that maybe it's not even the trigger, but the anxiety that you have over the thought that it is a trigger that actually brings on the headache. So he suggests learning how to cope with the triggers, and even did some studies where he exposed patients to like varying durations of light over time to kind of like desensitize the nervous system to that trigger, and found that maybe with a few of the basic triggers like light and noise in particular, that maybe that might be a better strategy. The problem is there's no real mechanism to do that type of therapy where you gradually expose people to light or noise currently. So it's probably a strategy that's not practical at this time. Now, but along with that, I would say this is if you've got a lot of triggers, and let's say that you perceive that there are 20, 30, 40, 50 different triggers, then in some cases it becomes unhealthy to try to avoid all those things, particularly if it involves diet. You might be eating a diet that contains just potatoes and one other ingredient. It may not even be compatible with healthy nutrition. So there are times where emphasis on triggers can be harmful.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think we should know about our triggers and how they affect us?
Well, I think trigger factors have a very important role in treatment of your headaches. You first have to learn how to identify them. And I would say if you've got something that's really an obvious trigger, then I would just try to avoid that if possible. Some triggers are not avoidable. You can't really avoid the weather. You can't avoid your other factors like your menstrual periods. If you're not on birth control pills, they're going to come. So you just have to learn how to cope with these and treat these to the best of your ability. But if you identify triggers, I think you can reduce the frequency of your headaches.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That was a great episode. I hope everyone enjoyed that. This is Dr. Martin and Dr. Weitzel signing off of this episode of Heads Up. Please join us again next week. Good night.